Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to welcome you to the IPVS 2020 webinar. I am Fernanda Almeida, and together with Roberto Guedes and Peter Davies, would like to thank you for attending our event. The IPVS 2020 webinar will consist of the opening of the event, performed by me, followed by the summary of the scientific program, performed by Professor Roberto Guedes, who is the chair of the IPVS 2020 Scientific Committee, followed by Professor Peter Davies, presenting the Tom Alexander Memorial Lecture. Then there will be the presentation of the IPVS 2020 Proceedings, also performed by Professor Roberto Guedes. And then there will be the closing of the event performed by myself. Memories of Resilience. This is the title of my presentation. Resilience seems to be the most adequate word to express all that we have been through to reach this achievement, organizing an unforgettable event. It had all started about 8 years ago at the beautiful Jeju Island, when Brazil applied to host the IPVS Congress for the first time. However, we needed more experience. 2 years later, we went to Cancun, and again, we were not ready by that time. Finally, it was in Dublin in 2016 when we officially got the right to organize the most important Congress of the international pig veterinary community, the IPVS. This Congress addresses several topics, not only on pig health, but also related to other topics regarding production, such as reproduction, genetics, nutrition, welfare, and so on. It was a great honor, but also it was a tremendous responsibility, as above all, Brazil is a big player in the world's agribusiness scenario. From now on, would have a representative at this outstanding society. The International Pig Veterinary Society has a representative board whose members are Dr. Ernest Sanford, who chaired the event in 2010 in Canada, Dr. Wong Yang Lee, who chaired this event in 2012 in South Korea, Dr. Alberto Stefano, who chaired the event in Mexico in 2014, Dr. Pat Kirwan, who chaired the event in 2016 in Ireland, Professor Han Chung Yang, who chaired the event in China 2018, Professor Johannes Kaufhold, who will chair the event in Germany 2024, Dr. Francois Nierkerk, the IPVS General Secretary, and myself, who is chairing the event in 2020 and 2022. China 2018, we were officially the president of the IPVS Society, and we started to plan all the Congress for 2018. So we started with sponsoring contacts, putting together an attractive scientific and social programs. As the president of the IPVS 2020, I should say that our event will be known as the Congress of Resilience. We overcome African swine fever by creating a biosecurity committee, performing a very nice risk assessment, and moving the host city to Rio de Janeiro. The south of Brazil is the main pig producing area, and we needed to protect our herd as we would be facing a massive transit of people from all over the world. By then, we had to rearrange our plans to adapt to the new conference venue and establish a whole new structure within a few months. And we made it. And we made it because the IPVS 2020 counts on a local organizing committee, which I do appreciate. I am grateful and honored to have by my side. Here it is, Professor Roberto Guedes, Scientific Committee Chair, Dr. Isabel Muniz, Financial Director, Dr. Hamilton Silva, Commercial Director, Dr. Lia Kosvik, Biosecurity Director, Dr. Lauren Ventura, Social Director, and Dr. José Antonio Ribas, Corporate Relations Director. My dear colleagues, thank you very much for all your input and commitment. So our Congress was ready to go, beautifully organized to take place from June 2nd to 5th, and we were delighted to welcome you. However, unexpectedly, the whole world faced the COVID-19 pandemic in the beginning of this year. We announced the reschedule of the IPVS 2020 for November, hoping that the situation would be under control by then. Unfortunately, that was not the case. Hence, given the scenario, the IPVS 2020 Local Organizing Committee, supported by the IPVS Board and the IPVS 2020 sponsors, decided to postpone the IPVS Brazil to 2022. It was tough, but was a wise decision, aiming for the safety of all involved in our event, delegates, sponsors, and local organizing committee. After all that it was reported so far, the IPVS 2020 could not just be taken away from others' mind without officially closing the whole cycle. And that's why we're here today, November 3rd, which was supposed to be the first day of the IPVS 2020 Congress, and we would be celebrating this great achievement. As we cannot have face-to-face contact, we can do so virtually, which is the new normal way to gather people. I would like to acknowledge all contributors to the IPVS 2020, in particular, the sponsors for their support, which was crucial to preserve the LOC's soundness. Here they are by category: Boehringer Ingelheim, PharmaBase, IPRA, MSD Animal Health, Zoetis, Elanco, Seva, Agroceres PIC, IDEX, Lanxess, Ouro Fino, Trau Nutrition, Biopharma, Pharmacosmos, Magapor, Phytobiotics, Thermo Fisher, Crystal Spring, Tonicit, Vet Science, APC, Microvet, and Biotech. Thank you very much for all your support. I would also like to thank the speakers, in particular, Professor Peter Davies, who is here representing all the speakers, the scientific committee members for investing their precious time to prepare such an attractive scientific program, the reviewers for all their input in evaluating the abstracts submitted, and my colleagues from the IPVS board for their endless support. Following our agenda, I would now like to invite Professor Roberto Guedes, Chair of the Scientific Committee, to present a summary of the scientific program. Roberto, please, the screen is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Fernanda. I'll just start sharing my screen. Okay, can you see the screen and hear me well? Okay, thank you very much. Greetings, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today with you all. Of course, I would rather be physically in Rio, in a conference ballroom, sharing information and seeing good friends, but that's not the case, unfortunately. And that was the best that we could do in this situation that we are facing with a global pandemic. So as Fernanda mentioned previously, the idea here is to present the scientific program that was put together to offer the updated information for everybody. And in order to do that, we, of course, had many help. So we had a group of 20 people that were members of the scientific committee that were divided in their specialties in 15 different thematic areas. And just for example, Professor Fabio Vanucci from University of Minnesota, the co-chair or vice chair of this scientific committee, was in charge of two thematic areas, miscellaneous and clinical cases. Myself, Professor David Barcelo and Dominique Mais from Belgium were in charge of the bacterial disease. Heraldo Janella from University of Passo Fundo was involved in the production and innovation area. Fernando Almeida and Fernando Bortoloso, reproduction. Luiz Guilherme Oliveira, Janice Zanella from Embrapa Swine and Poultry, and Jeff Zimmerman from Iowa State were organizing the viral disease section, Daniel Linhares from Iowa State Biosecurity, and a team formed by Jalusa Deon Kish, Professor Marisa Cardoso, and also our Peter Davies in two different areas, antimicrobial and food safety. Anja Jokin from Austria was in charge of the parasites and parasitic disease section. Professor Aldoaldo Zanella from USP was involved in the welfare. John Plusky, nutrition from Australia. Professor Rafael Frondoloso, along with Janice Zanella, organized the immunology and vaccinology section. Professor Robson Tunis, genetics, and finally, Dr. Nazaré Lisboa, herd management. So as you can see, many people put a lot of effort in organizing this very interesting event and innovative. By the way, today we would be starting the event in the afternoon, and we would start with a new section, actually with the three pre-conference sections, simultaneous pre-conference sections, with three different subjects: animal welfare, reproduction, and African swine fever. The welfare section was organized by Professor Aldoaldo Zanella and named Pig Welfare, Demands in the Year 2050. And he brought along three different speakers: Carlos Guerreiro Bossagna from Sweden, that would talk about epigenetic markers for stress and welfare. Professor Inger Lise Andersen from Norway, that will discuss about housing system for growing finishing pigs based on behavior. And Professor Mark Holmes from University of Cambridge, that would talk about welfare, a challenge of antimicrobial resistance. For the second simultaneous section, reproduction, named Key Points to Face the Challenges of Contemporary Soils, Professor Fernando Almeida and Fernando Bortoloso put together a section with four speakers. George Foxcroft from Canada, talking about birth weight effect and efficient genetic transfer from nucleus to production herds. Professor John Plusky from Murdoch University, would talk about colostrum and milk intake effect on GI tract development. Nicoline Sood from Wageningen University and Research in the Netherlands would talk from the follicle pool to the piglet weight, birth weight. And finally, Fernando Bortoloso would mention about production traits in South lifetime production. And finally, the last third section in the pre-conference about innovation to control African swine fever. Myself and Professor Fabio Vanucci put together a section with 3 speakers from Spain and 1 from Russia. We would start with José Manuel Sánchez Vizcaíno from Universidad Complutense de Madrid that would give us an overview about the global perspective of African swine fever, followed by Dr. Marisa Arias, that would mention the disease evolution and the history of the ASF. Then Denis Kolbasov from Russia would provide us with the experience of Asian countries that are facing the challenge of the ASF. And we will finalize with Dr. Professor Carmina Gallardo that would discuss the importance of diagnostics for epidemiological investigation. For the conclusion of this first day, that would be today, Tuesday afternoon, that will take from 2 to 5:30 in the afternoon. Then we would have the opening ceremony with the Tom Alexander Memorial Lecture that will be provided by Dr. Peter Davies in a few minutes. And tomorrow we would be starting our core event with sections, 4 simultaneous sections in the morning and 4 simultaneous sections in the afternoon on Wednesday and Thursday, and in the morning of Friday. So in total, we would have 20 different sections comprising 15 different thematic areas. And in each of these thematic areas, we would have a keynote speaker that would have 20 minutes for his presentation, followed by questioning. And then we would have between 5 and 7 abstracts, oral presentation within each area, thematic areas. We would comprise a total of 116 abstracts, oral presentations from Wednesday morning to Friday morning. For each section for instance, bacterial disease and viral disease, as we were expecting many abstracts, we put 3 different sections for them, 2 for immunology and vaccinology. At the beginning would be only 1, but then we will increase based on the number of abstracts that were submitted. And we had a conflict of agenda of Professor Cassandra Jones. So just to make a propaganda of the subject that will be covered and will be available in the proceedings, I will comment just a little bit about the subject of every single one here, and it will be very interesting. So for the bacterial disease, we would have Professor Marcelo Gottschalk from Canada, University of Montreal, talking about the constraints of antimicrobial reduction facing the Streptococcus suis infection. Professor Maria Peters from University of Minnesota, discussing the challenging and innovations regarding Mycoplasma herpes pneumonia infection. And Professor John Morris Fairbrother from Canada, talking about the challenges of post-weaning E. coli. For the viral disease sections, also a very important one, we do also have 3 different keynote speakers. Again, Professor Carmina Gallardo from Spain, discussing about the importance of diagnostic for prevention and control of of African swine fever. The second section by Enric Mateu from Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, Spain, that would talk about vaccine and vaccination for the control of PRRS. And at the end, Dr. Amy Vincent from USDA, telling us the lessons learned about influenza after the pandemic H1N1 outbreak. For the immunology and vaccinology section, we had increased for 2 sections. The first one from Professor John Butler from University of Iowa, confronting emerging disease in swine. Actually, it's a perspective, immunologist perspective for PRRS vaccination. And the other section would be provided by Rafael Frandoloso, that would be discussing the structure, the strategies of antigen design for respiratory and systemic pathogens. For biosecurity, both sections or both speakers had provided the text that will be included in the proceedings. Dr. Daryl Duhamel from Iowa State will talk about the pathogens entry in populations and biosecurity programs. And Professor Cassandra Jones from Kansas State would contribute with the risk of pathogen spread via feed, a very important issue, mainly after the spread of PED in US. For food safety, we would have a speaker from Portugal that's working at the Danish DTU, Danish Technical University, Professor Dr. Sarah Monteiro Pires, that would be talking about toxoplasma gondii infection to source, current knowledge, and addressing data gaps. And for the clinical cases, it's actually a section that we had received many abstracts. Professor Ken Pedersen, also a practitioner in Denmark, would be talking about herd diagnostics and selecting solution for intestinal problems in clinical practice. The main focus would be Lawsonia intracellularis. For the antimicrobial section, Dr. Jap Wagner from Wageningen University and Research will talk about antimicrobial stewardship in pig health management, with main emphasis in antimicrobial multi-resistant microorganisms. For herd management, Dr. Carlos Pinheiro, good friend, also fan of NBA basketball. He would talk about management of people in swine production, what a data says, a very important aspect of swine production. For production and innovation, a consultant, Dr. Aidan Connolly, would describe and discuss for us imaging and digital future for precision pork production. So he would mention about robotics, sensors, drones, artificial intelligence, and all that could be provided by those tools for precision pork production. For genetics, Professor Austin Putz from Iowa State and Hendrix Genetics will discuss about very important aspect of selection for resilience. That's the new trend in genetic selection for resilience in modern swine breeding programs. For the miscellaneous, we would have a bioengineer from Norway that is in fact living in Brazil. He's working in the Santa Casa General Hospital in São Paulo, but also lecturing at the Norwegian University, and has a private company, EVA Scientific. And he's specialized in tissue culture and organs, providing for xenotransplantation. So tissue and organs for pigs used for human in xenotransplantation. Very, very interesting subject. For parasites and parasitic disease, would have the contribution of Professor Joke van der Giessen from Germany, discussing the impact and control of parasitic zoonosis via pork, with main emphasis on quantitative risk assessments of trichinosis, cysticercosis, and Toxoplasma gondii. Finally, reproduction. Again, Professor George Foxcroft will discuss about guilt development program for the next decade. Nutrition, Professor John Plusky would mention about a very important stage and period for the piglet. That's the weaning period, the weaning transition period in relation to the gut health and gut development. And finally, for the welfare section, we would have Professor Inger Andersen discussing about farrowing system insights about maternal behavior. So with that, I would like to thank all the invited speakers to accept the invitation and providing us with the text material that will be included in the proceedings that will be available to everybody. And representing all those speakers, we will have today Professor Peter Davies from the University of Minnesota that will be performing a presentation as an invited speaker for the Tom Alexander Memorial Lecture with the title of Predicting the Challenging Swine Health and Production in 2050. With that, I will mention a biography of Professor Peter Davies. Professor Davies received his veterinary degree from the University of Melbourne, Australia, and his PhD from the University of Sydney, also in Australia. Peter is a veterinary epidemiologist specialized in infectious disease of food animals, particularly swine, and has been a professor at the College of Veterinary Medicine, University of Minnesota, US, since 2003. My loss, as I finished my PhD there in 2002, I did not have the opportunity to have Peter as my professor, but I have been known him since then. His professional experience includes 6 years of clinical veterinary practice in Australia, New Zealand, and UK, 2 years as a livestock advisor on a rural development project in Pernambuco, Brazil. That's why he's also fluent in Portuguese, but don't worry, his presentation will be in English. 4 years as a swine specialist with the Department of Agriculture in Adelaide, South Australia, and 25 years as academic researcher. He has held endowed chair appointment as the MAF Professor of Food Safety and Public Health at the Massey University in New Zealand. He was the Lehman Chair of Swine Health and Production at the University of Minnesota. In addition to the swine health research, Dr. Davies' research has focused on epidemiology of zoonotic and foodborne pathogens, including antimicrobial resistance at the farm level. He is an author of over 100 peer-reviewed articles and more than 250 conference papers. He was a member of the Scientific Advisor Committee of the International Research Center for Veterinary Epidemiology in Denmark, and he serves as a member of the Presidential Advisor Committee of Combating Antibiotic-Resistant Bacteria in the US, and in 2019, last year, received the Howard Doom Memorial Award for the service to the US swine industry and the American Association of Swine Veterinarians. So, Peter, with that, I thank you very, very much for your kind and possibility of being here with us and accepting the invitation for your presentation. So the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. I hope the slides are projecting properly for you there. I'd first like to welcome everyone who's taken the time to join us this morning and hear what a program we've missed out on in Brazil for 2020, but also give us more motivation to come to Brazil in 2020, 2022. I also want to congratulate all the Brazilian people involved with the challenges that they've had, which have been much, much greater than preceding IPVS. It's also always a big event to put together such a big program. And I congratulate them for taking on all the difficulties they have. And I think we look forward to an even more exciting program in 2022. Obviously, for me, it's a great honor to be invited to give the Tom Alexander Memorial lecture. Dr. Alexander was a founding father for IPVS. He was chairman of the organizing committee in 1969 of the first meeting. He was a distinguished academician. He was an international consultant to swine production for decades. And he also was a pig farm owner and industry innovator. So Tom really spanned the full spectrum from being a scientist at one end to a pig producer on the other. And he embodies the goals of the IPVS to really bring together science to address practical problems and move the pig industry forward. So I again, acknowledge the enormous contribution that Dr. Tom Alexander has made to our industry and our profession. I also want...
You have you shared the screen? I can see.
No. How's that, Roberto?
Now it's going. Now it's go. Thank you.
Apologies to everyone then. We had a little technical glitch there. Hopefully we'll be more smooth now. I also want to acknowledge, I just showed my previous slide again, just to, for those who didn't know Tom Alexander, to recognize him visually. He was such a presence at IPVS for many decades. I also want to acknowledge the previous Tom Alexander lecturers, Hank Harris, Dan Tucker, John Harding, Jill Thompson, and Trevor Drew for the contributions they've made to those meetings. I just want to touch on a couple of the topics. Obviously, 2 out of the last 3 Alexander lectures have focused on transboundary emerging diseases, emerging porcine diseases. And obviously, the circumstances we're in now with COVID, with ASF, you can see how pertinent those presentations continue to be. A difficult thing in putting together a talk like this is deciding exactly what you wish to talk about. And one of the things I took into account is the general theme of the 2020 Congress, which is knowing the challenges to increase profitability. And I just noted here that I had to submit my proceedings paper on by February 5th, 2020. And we all know that the world was changing very quickly at that point in time. And so some of the thoughts, I'm just going to share with you some of the thoughts that are part of my proceedings presentation, but in anticipation of perhaps the events of 2020. The first comment is that it's not surprising that 2 of the last 3 Alexander lectures have focused on emerging diseases, because the disruption of global pork markets that have been caused by the Eurasian epidemic of African swine fever is still unfolding and is compounded by whatever the COVID coronavirus may inflict upon the Chinese and global economies. As we know, from then till now, the pandemic has probably extended beyond anyone's imagination at that point in time. And even at this juncture, we're still seeing record numbers of cases and deaths globally. So this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. I've just got a slide here to look at the economic impact, and this is economic growth in the US by quarter. Compared to the previous quarter. And you can see the first 2 quarters, the ones in red there, are the impact on the US gross domestic product, and the drop in the second quarter was the biggest on record, and we still have a long way to go before our economies turn around. The other thought, and again, this is just lifted from the proceedings and my thinking in February, were that the impacts of ASF will continue to evolve, and perhaps dramatically, between the time that I wrote the paper and the delivery of the address, which was then going to be in June 2020. Now I'm doing it in my tie in my basement with no one around me, which I never expected. But the epidemic is already unprecedented in the scale of its impact on the global pork supply, and maybe the biggest disturbance to the global protein supply of my lifetime. This issue will dominate the IPVS Congress. Obviously, the COVID has probably dominated a little more, but I just wanted to point out, for as many of you are aware, that just a couple of days ago, we had expansion of the area affected by ASF in Germany, and that the issue of ASF in Germany is really reshaping the landscape of particularly the Chinese pork market due to German ASF. So Germany was, in 2017 data, exporting 17% of Chinese imports, and the ASF epidemic has put an end to that, and that's really having still a huge impact on the global pork trade, but particularly must recognize the German industry. And I think all of our industries have to be preparing for potential shocks that this epidemic can cause for them. The theme of my talk, though, is not on COVID or ASF, because a little bit we have some COVID fatigue, but I think that I really wanted to step back and say, you know, those issues aside, in the coming decades for the global swine industry, what might some of the challenges be beyond infectious diseases, and put to you that some of them will be even less under our control and will be driven by technical changes and societal changes. So the thoughts I'm going to share with you now are really offered to prompt discussion and thought about what challenges are most likely to influence the prosperity of the pork production into the 50s. And I chose 2050 simply because it's about 30 years since IPVS was in Brazil, and really look forward to perhaps another meeting in Brazil in 2050, which I would not expect that I would be at. In talking about prediction, I don't think I'm in a position to predict the outcome of the US presidential election today. So in terms of what I can predict in 2050 is very hard to suggest. But the National Intelligence Council of the US puts out reports every few years about predicting and discussing what the world might look like in the long term. And I just drew on one of their comments as saying, we're not really trying to predict the future, but to provide a framework for thinking about possible futures and their implications. So what I'm going to share with you now are my thoughts about this. Some will be very wrong, some might be close to right, but I think it's really just to our industry to stand back and think about what the future might hold for us. I'll start with a little bit of the obvious for a pig veterinary audience, and again, in this context of knowing the challenges to profitability, pig veterinarians will continue to be primarily engaged in production and obviously health management as part of production, because that's our niche and our expertise. I'll put to you that good production is going to be necessary, but not sufficient for sustained profitability. We've already seen worldwide the improvements in standard production over the last 30 years, and just to stay competitive within the industry, it's very important that high standards of production are achieved. Obviously, we're in a broader food market, and consumers have to decide where to spend their money, so affordability will always matter, particularly as the food market and the protein market gets more diverse and more competitive, and I'll speak about that a little bit later. And just a final point, when we talk about getting more efficient, getting more profitable, just to point out that the major beneficiaries of advancement in production have been and will continue to be consumers and not producers. I go back to the wisdom of Adam Smith, the famous economist, who pointed out the sole purpose of economic activity is consumption, not production. And we always need to be looking at the needs and the wants of our consumers to shape the directions of our industry going forward. Pursuit of profitability, I've made the expression here that profitability is a fickle mistress to pursue. For those who don't speak English so well, it really means it's unpredictable and difficult. Certainly, global factors matter a lot in profitability, but the most important things are supply and demand in local markets. With the Chinese ASF epidemic, we've seen enormous opportunities for countries to export into China and profit opportunities with that. Dr. Dennis DiPietri analyzed this back in December and showed that in Spain, a major exporter, most of that profit opportunity was being transferred to producers, whereas in the US, it was not. Producers were struggling to break even, but most of the profit opportunities were going to the downstream sectors of the industry. So even though these industries were exporting with a new opportunity for profitability, the distribution of the profits really depends on supply and demand in local markets. So I want to say, rather than the quest for profitability, what does success look like in 30 years for the global swine industry? And I put to you, it's the extent to which pork maintains or expands its share of the global protein market into the future. That will be the definition of our success. And I'll also put to you the thought that maintaining demand will be a greater challenge than improving production. And we'll talk through. This slide is just per capita meat consumption in the US over about a 45-year period. What I want to point out to you is the green line, which is the per capita consumption of pork. We can see beef consumption gone down. Largely, the winner has been poultry, the chicken industry. But in the US pork industry, we have not progressed in terms of consumer consumption of our product. The graph I've superimposed there is the inflation-adjusted hog price for US from 1987 to 2009, and that corresponds with essentially the first 30 years of PRRS in the US swine industry, our major infectious disease problem. And you can see that despite PRRS, our industry reduced the price of our product, but we didn't increase per capita consumption. The beneficiaries were the consumers who were able to get our products at a lower real price than they had. And I put this forward really as a model of what can happen with as we continue to strive for better production, that the major beneficiaries will be consumers who are able to purchase our product at a more competitive price. If we step back a little to the world and look at projections for overall food demand, it's projected to grow for about 14% per decade, and that's largely in line with population growth. Another observation, and this largely comes from FAO, is that the growth in per capita meat consumption has been in decline. It's not that it's not growing, but it's growing less and less. And some developed countries may have passed what they're calling peak meat, so the point where they've reached peak consumption. So the projection is, particularly in some of the wealthier communities, we're going to see declines in per capita meat consumption and not increases. One landmark, I think, for many years, I've been telling people how pork is the most consumed meat in the world. According to FAO, poultry overtook pork as the most consumed meat in 2018. And that just reminds us that we're in a very competitive protein market, and we need to pedal faster to remain competitive. Other messages from the FAO is that per capita pork consumption is projected to grow about 0.8% per annum through till 2030, that will be about 20%, but again, only about a third as fast as projected poultry growth. But I point out that these projections are really extrapolations from earlier trends, and they're therefore vulnerable to things that happen, unanticipated events. One of the impacts of COVID, and certainly in the US, is that people have gone and bought more meat rather than less wheat. I think a return to comfort in times of uncertainty. Disrupting technologies, societal change, and I'll come back and I'll speak about all of those issues. Just the question of change, and many of you are probably familiar with this expression. Change is the only constant, and that tracks back to well BC, to a gentleman called Heraclitus. People who are studying change, and I've got an example here from Ray Kurzweil, who says the analysis of the history of technology says change is exponential, it's not linear. So change is not constant, acceleration is what's happening. And that we won't experience 100 years of progress in the 21st century. It'll be more like 20,000 years of progress. And I think all of us in our day-to-day life now know how quickly things have changed in the last 20 years, even to the fact that we're sitting here having a Zoom meeting from my basement. But things are very different, and I think anticipation of that accelerating change is something we need to take on board in our industry as we look at our models. So in thinking about what 2050 might look like, I just make the statement that the next 30 years promise to deliver rates of change in how we live and what we eat at scales beyond what we've previously experienced or possibly can even imagine. There's this concept called the paradox of progress. When we're talking about 20,000 years of progress, what do we really mean? And the paradox of progress is that progress is associated with other things that are complications. And one is we move forward as a society, we create more problems. And Roberto and I were speaking earlier about the problems of getting children off computers and mobile phones in the modern era. Higher economic growth and consumerism lead to more stress as people work more, society falls behind. And these are just statements that have been made about people who've been writing about the paradox of progress, of which there's probably 6 or 8 books. The more we know, the more we have to discover. I think as researchers, we understand that implicitly. We get new tools to look at things, and we have many more questions. But I think for the swine industry, the one that strikes with me most is the better things become, the worse they are perceived. So I want to just talk about modern food systems as a paradox of progress, because from my own view in Minnesota in the wintertime, and where I can buy mangoes and tropical fruit all year round, the food industry is a marvel to me. The efficiency, the convenience of access to diverse dietary options in much of the world. Obviously, there's affordability and there's income issues and there's poverty. We still don't have a perfect global food system, but it is an incredibly efficient tool. But it's subject to aggressive criticism. There's books written on a probably weekly to monthly basis critical of modern food systems and the corporatization of them and overlooking of other factors. So we have this paradox of a highly efficient productive system that is subject to a lot of, and not all, should we say, unfounded, but we need to realize that there's a conflict here in one part between our technological progress and our social perception of it. Just to note that agriculture currently covers more than 40% of the usable land in the world, uses more than 2/3 of the fresh water. So we're a big industry, we have enormous impact, but we are feeding 10 billion people, and that's not a trivial undertaking. And so I make the comment that into the future, the food industries will be shaped to some extent by environmental sustainability questions and the relative efficiencies and externalities of those industries. And I make the point here, real and perceived. And it may be that perceptions of industries' impact may have more sway than actual the realities. And that is, again, a challenge to our communication. So in pork production, I'll say the same thing. In 30-something years, I've been pretty much devoted into the swine world. We've seen, I think, very measurable progress in most facets of production. Most notably, from my area where I've worked a lot in pork safety, we have a phenomenally safe product and more safe than it's ever been in history. I think we've got data from everywhere on efficiency and cost production, and that we've made a lot of progress. Coupled with that, reductions in carbon footprint and environmental impact. I think animal welfare is always a difficult discussion, but I think there's arguments to be made that we have made progress in animal welfare as well as these other areas. But almost uniformly, we'll see that the person in the street or next to you on the aircraft or in the elevator will see intensive animal production as a negative thing, as worse than whatever they imagined to before, and there'll be health issues, environmental issues, ethical, sociological issues. There's a lot of negative perception about an industry that I think has made enormous strides in progress in many areas. And that brings us to the challenge, which is a major challenge that I've actually written about before, in misinformation and how to counteract misinformation into the future. And I think that will continue to be one of the challenges for our industry, and things that certainly we already try to address, but we need to perhaps be more coordinated in. It's hard not to talk about climate change, even though it's a very controversial issue. Just want to touch on that because recognition of its, well, it goes back as far as 1804, and the great German scientist Humboldt wrote to Thomas Jefferson in the US and said, the wants and restless activity of largely communities of men gradually despoil the face of the earth. And he was talking about the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. So realizing that human impact will have negative consequences. A Swedish scientist, Arrhenius, was the first that I could find at least, who reported on the fact that elevated CO2 levels in the air will have an impact on temperature of the ground. So here is the first real scientific recognition of climate change related to CO production as a scientific phenomenon. And if we look at the data, and this is data from a US government agency looking at 800,000 years of atmospheric CO2 levels, and we can see that we had fluctuations, large fluctuations over a long period of time, but what has happened in the last 100 years is phenomenal, and we're at the highest level for 800,000 years and beyond the areas of history. So there's not much argument that CO2 in the atmosphere is way beyond what it has been for most of human existence. And just for those like me who are nerdy and you want to know the latest data, it's increasing about 2 to 2.5 parts per million per year at the moment. I'm an Australian. Many of you will remember that about a year ago, we had the worst, most disastrous bushfires in Australia, and they had an enormous impact on agricultural areas. How we view climate change, I think, is very diverse, and you'll recognize most of these players, particularly Greta Thunberg, the eyes of a young Swedish woman looking at climate change and what it might mean to her life, and then a collection of leaders of some of our largest economies, including the Australian Prime Minister who went on holiday to Hawaii when the fires were on. So he attracted a lot of negative press about that. But we have world leadership in many countries at the moment, certainly either denying or not acting on climate change, and a generation of young people that are really perturbed by it. So I know that in our community we'll have different opinions, divisive opinions, but I think that if we think climate change won't affect our industry going into the future, I think, again, through reality or perception, I think we need to think a little more broadly. First thing is that Who doesn't think that agriculture is sensitive to weather and the climate? The realities and perceptions of climate change will influence pork supply and demand. And I've listed a few things there: extreme weather events, volatility in food prices due to less predictable weather patterns. There's predictions that with that we'll see more variability in the nutritional value of crops, and therefore difficulty in feed formulation. And also that there'll be winners and losers. The climate change is going to impact different areas very differently. So some areas will actually be advantaged, some will be disadvantaged. But I think probably at this stage, the biggest challenge comes from consumer perceptions about the link between animal agriculture and climate change. Many of you will be familiar with a report called Livestock's Long Shadow from 2006. It estimated agriculture's contribution to greenhouse gases of being 18% and equivalent or more than transport. This study has been shown to be methodologically flawed, but is still highly cited to today, particularly in the popular media and dare we say social media. And it greatly overestimated the livestock contribution, but it's had an impact on societal perceptions that's been very, very difficult to correct. I've got a reference in the proceedings about this data, but from the US data, animal agriculture is estimated to contribute 3.9% of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's still a real contribution, but nothing of the order of what the FAO document suggested. The challenge to us is how entrenched is public perception and how will it be addressed? On the other side, we've got to recognize that eating plant-based foods ultimately can be more efficient if our consumers chose that than on a meat-based diet. And so we have to really, it's a delicate path to navigate, but I think having reliable information to communicate to producers about the impact of their dietary choices, because some plant-based choices are also very environmentally perhaps detrimental. Roberto spoke about the presentations from Carlos Pinheiro and Aidan Connolly about technology, and I think that's great to see, and it'll be a big part of the next meeting, because I've mentioned before, we're living in times of enormous technological change, and we can see digital revolutions, biotechnology, big chain, blockchain, alternative proteins. On the right-hand side, the picture, you may not recognize it, that's a flying automobile. So just this week in Slovakia, I think they trialed out the first car that takes off. And to me, I remember seeing cartoons like that as a kid, and I thought, that's never going to happen. So again, we don't want to dismiss technical possibilities, in particular, what it might mean to the protein industry. And this is not my area, but again, I think things we need to be talking about in uptake of technology is, will smarter mean better? Will technology actually make us, improve animal health, well-being, and the efficiency of our enterprises? How do we capture the benefits? I think that on one side, there's a concern about solutions looking for problems. So once a tool becomes available, we really want to say, how can we fit that into our operations and make the most of it, which is commendable, but it's not always saying, what are the problems that we have, the biggest problems that may be best have solutions in technology. And at the Layman Conference in September, we had a keynote speaker, Dave Wade from Hanover Company, and someone asked him the question, what would you most want for technology to give you? And he said, something that stopped the feed bridging up and blocking in the feed lines in the finishing plants. And so he was saying, a real problem we have is just a very basic physical thing that happens, and that's what he'd like to fix. So again, I just want to keep us thinking about, rather than being dazzled by technology and tools and sensors, how do we link it to the problems we both need to, we all need to address? The other side of technology is the acceptance piece. As a food safety person in the 90s, unacceptable in the meat industries. If not, there's many of foods that are irradiated, spices most notably, but we're not seeing any movement on food irradiation. I think the more modern version is gene editing. We're familiar, particularly the exciting work that's been done with PRRS virus and now some other viruses, where we can, through gene editing technology, we can produce pigs that just don't recognize the PRRS virus. I think the potential for the industry is enormous, but we've got huge regulatory barriers and social barriers. So just because we can do something doesn't mean that we will be able to, or from a regulatory point of view, or that our consumers will think that it's a good thing. So again, I really look forward to 2022 and by then what the technology talks will bring to us, because I think a lot of work is going on in that space, and I think it's very exciting. On the other side of the technology is what I'm calling the brave new diet. And here's a quote from a group, there's a group called Rethink, and they're saying, we're on the cusp of the deepest, fastest, most consequential disruption in food and agricultural production since the first domestication of plants and animals 10,000 years ago. I think there may be a little bit of hyperbole in that statement because there are people who are into that world, but I think the potential is certainly there that we're going to see major innovation. And we can see that in the US, we have intense investment into alternatives to animal protein. The graph on the right there is showing investments in alternative proteins in the millions in the US, and you can see how that's increased. And in fact, 2020, the first quarter, the investment was equivalent to 2019, which is what you're seeing the peak of the graph. So a lot of money is going into alternative proteins, and be they cultured animal proteins, plant-based proteins, insect or algal proteins, or technology using bacteria called precision fermentation or others. There's a lot of activity in the alternative protein space that is potentially direct competitors to conventional meats. On the other side, it's not easy to do any of that stuff, and it's not cheap, and it's not without environmental impact. And some of these initiatives have already had some setbacks in the marketplace. What I want to point out, though, is it's a long road here, and they don't all need to succeed. In fact, we only need one of them to succeed. So I'd say we ignore them at our peril. Point out that almond milk in the US is now more than a quarter of what we'll call the milk market. Again, you can argue whether almond milk is milk and what it's called, but it's been a substantial increase in the share of the market share. So I think that's a warning to us. And also that a lot of our major animal protein companies are now entering the alternative protein market. So they're protein companies, they're historically meat companies, but in the future protein companies, and they're broadening their portfolios, which means our competition is broadening. On the other side, I hope I'm too old for insects to ever become an important part of my diet, because I think consumer behavior, eating has very deep cultural roots, and people don't change that quickly. So consumer behavior will lag behind technology in rate of change. So again, just because these things can be done, there'll be lags in consumer uptake because people like to eat the foods that they are accustomed to. The counterpoint to that is generational shifts in food preferences. And there's already data that younger sectors of the community are 10% less likely to purchase meats. And so we're going to have generations growing up now with this diversity of protein options, and their purchasing patterns are going to be different. So by 2050, a generational change may be a significant factor on the future demand for meat generally and specifically pork. And in wealthier societies, food choices are increasingly a statement of identity of people. So we have people being gluten-free, all sorts of things that may not be nutritionally necessarily or beneficial, but there's social status attached to food preferences increasingly. And that, again, can positively or negatively impact an industry. So getting towards the end, I have to stop and say, okay, I'm touching on all these issues that are going to affect pork industry in the future. Where will this all leave us? Firstly, is that if we go back a couple hundred years, meat consumption has evolved from being a luxury, celebratory food item to a dietary staple in most communities, most parts of the world, and that is largely been a result of the efficiency and the progress that's been made in the meat industries for their products to be cost competitive. Pork consumption is deeply embedded in many cultures, and that's not going to change quickly. It's very well recognized that income growth and urbanization are positively correlated with meat consumption. We see that within countries and between countries. There is, historically at least, a preference for animal proteins, and as people become wealthier, they eat more of them. So if we stop and think about that, and issues of income inequality globally and within many countries, which is again a very topical societal issue, the evolution of income equality is going to impact the positioning and perceptions of meat and pork. And I guess the possibility that meat or pork could become a luxury item again because of those multiple factors. So I think what two things happening is that we're seeing some societal pressures that are pushing us. We're seeing niche market opportunities, or organic styled alternative production that are pulling the industry towards higher production costs and likely lower aggregate demand. So as soon as we have any regulatory or other incentives that make us produce at a higher cost, that's going to mean reduction in aggregate demand for the products. I think that if these are they may be enforced through markets, they may be enforced through regulations. If enforced through regulations, things like welfare standards, antimicrobial use standards, and we're already seeing that, we can expect them to translate into trade barriers. And I think there's a real risk here that some trade issues will be divorced from real benefits. And I think we can use both welfare standards and antibiotic use standards as areas where standards are set, but those standards aren't necessarily closely linked to societal benefits. And that'll be a very controversial statement for some people, but I think it's something we need to be wary of. And obviously trade policy, we've lived for the last 50 years of a period of increasingly free trade, and that's there's signs of opposition to that in many countries, including the US in recent history. So trade policy will also have a big impact on particularly the exporting industries that have increasingly got a bigger piece of market share. I think I've gone the wrong way there. I think to finish up, the good news, we have an affordable, nutritious and relatively safe products that are widely valued by consumers. And I think we need to look back at the progress made and the quality of the products that we have. I think we need to recognize that the pork, unless there's a biological shift through technology, we will not win the price battle against poultry or seafoods. Truly, because of feed efficiency factors, we will compare favorably with ruminant proteins. I think we're still going to strive for improvements in productivity, but they're going to be harder and harder to get. Our best farms in the US have farrowing rates above 90% now. It's hard to get much better than that. Similarly with litter size, we're hitting the points where we can't increase litter size without negative concerns in piglet survival, sow welfare, those sorts of things. So it's going to be, we will improve productivity, but those gains will be harder and harder to win. And I think that effective health management, the things that veterinarians do, will be increasingly valued because more predictable parts of our production will be more and more less and less variable, shall we say. So health remains still a little bit of a wild card in production, and perhaps on the input side, the thing that is least predictable. So our ability to deliver good health management standards, I think, will be increasingly important in the future, particularly as we can anticipate more emerging disease events over the next 30 years in line with what we've seen over the last 30. So final comment here coming from a gentleman called Leon Magnuson is, it's not the strongest species that survives, not the most intelligent survive, it's the one that is most adaptable to change. So with that, Roberto, I will stop my sharing and turn the floor back to you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your perspectives for the next 30 years in the swine production. Very enlightening. And if we organize the IPVS in 2050, you will be our special guest.
I'll have a high technology wheelchair by then.
Okay, excellent. I have a very quick question for you. Okay.
Maybe a flying wheelchair.
Sure. Very quick question for you, Peter. It's my concern, and probably many people concerns regarding the misinformation that you mentioned during your presentation. So what's your opinion? What should we do best, or what should we do more in order to communicate and inform better the society regarding the pork production, the welfare, all the concerns that we have with those things today?
Yeah, I think the most important part is transparency, however we achieve it. And certainly there's a lot of efforts in the US to get more people on farms. The difficulty we have biosecurity increasingly a concern because of effective disease management. And so it is difficult to take large numbers of people onto farms. We have demonstration projects. I think taking influential people. I know in Minnesota we've taken senators out onto farms, rural senators from urban backgrounds. So just to say to them to understand that, you know, behind each farm there is a family, there are workers, there are people there, and those people generally are doing a really good job and are doing their best. Obviously, part of the problem is that it's not a perfect world and not a perfect industry, and there will always be events and bad players, and unfortunately, they are the things that get portrayed through YouTube and things as industry norms. Whereas I think the fact that most of our industries are dedicated people, real people doing good jobs with families, I think putting a human face to the industry is very important. I have an example back even 20 years in the Dutch veal industry, which had a lot of concerns of public concern about welfare and other things. There was a business there called Peter's Farms, no relation at all to me, but they'd set up video cameras in their barns. So that people who bought their product, they had a barcode. You could go on the internet and you could put it in, and then it would show the farmer with his kids and his dog and the farm, and then video links into the barns. It was very, very successful for their business, and that was 20 years ago. Obviously, that's not a workable solution for everyone, but I think we need to work very hard on the issue of transparency and getting our story. And I think another thing is calling out misinformation when it happens. And as a person in the academic community, we see fairly rampant misinformation, even in the peer-reviewed literature, particularly in inferences that people draw from their data. And I think it's you could have a full-time job just trying to point out the inaccuracies in some of those statements and inferences. So I think it's not just the worst end of social media. I think we in the scientific community, and you'll be familiar with it, you will see things that really don't get called out by the editorial process and reviewers, but which are outlandish. So I think no matter where you're coming from, there's things you can do.
Yeah. So in fact, we have to be more proactive in that area, right?
Absolutely. And sadly, it's something that takes a lot of time that nobody pays you for. Maybe it can be a retirement interest for old professors. You know?
Yeah. So with that, Peter, we thank you very much for all your contribution in the scientific committee, organizing committee, and as a reviewer of our IPVS 2020, and to be with us as a Thomas Alexander Memorial Lecturer. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Roberto, and best wishes to all of us out there, and stay healthy.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. Now, people, I will share my screen again to complete my presentation before I pass the word to Fernanda again. So in the first part of my talk, I mentioned the structure of the event and mostly the keynote speaker. And now I will talk about the proceedings. I will focus more in the abstracts that were submitted. And the idea and the effort to put these proceeding together and turn it available for everybody was an effort and put value in the effort and the work done by all the speakers, the invited speakers, and also to the authors that have submitted the abstracts. Unfortunately, we will not have a formal event, physical or even digital. Actually, we prefer the option to postpone the event because, in our opinion, IPVS, one big part of IPVS is the meeting people, the get together and transfer information in presence. So we'll do that in a couple of years, in fact. So specifically regarding the abstracts, we received almost 800 abstracts, and there was a lot of work to evaluate and grade and rate all those abstracts. And nobody does that alone. So we had a big list of researchers that helped us, and they were involved in reviewing, reading, and scoring the abstracts. So our acknowledgement and thanks for all the reviewers. There were 51 reviewers. Remember that the scientific committee, all the scientific committee was included in this list. And so we comprised 51 researchers from 15 different countries and 5 different continents. So we thank you very, very much for your help. And just a summary of the abstracts that were submitted. The exact number of submissions was 781 abstracts for the 15 different thematic areas. Every single one of the abstracts were evaluated and scored in 8 different criteria and categories from 1 to 10. So each abstract would have a score ranging from 0 to 80. And that grade would help for selecting oral presentations and also for the award, both for posters and oral presentation that we would have if we had the event. And each abstract was evaluated by at least 2 reviewers in each area, and sometimes by 3 if there was a conflicting decision regarding the 2 first reviewers. Then the area coordinator would read the abstract again and decide what to do. With that, we had 690 accepted abstract, very close to 90%. So the reviewers were very restrictive, and we have a very good quality of abstracts. A little above 11% of abstracts were not accepted. And this is the distribution of the accepted abstracts. So among the 690 abstracts, most of them were in infectious disease, as we were suspecting since the beginning. Close to 60% of the abstracts were in bacterial, viral disease, or immunology and vaccinology. For our surprise, close to 10% of the abstracts were in the area of nutrition, an increase, I think an increase since the last IPVS. And the third would be production and innovation, antimicrobial, and reproduction, ranging from 5.2 to 5.5% of the accepted abstract, followed by herd management, miscellaneous, clinical case, and welfare with 3 to 3.5%. And finally, food safety, biosecurity, parasites and parasitic disease, and genetics, ranging from 1 to 1.5% of abstracts submitted. So with that, we acknowledge and thank all the authors for the submissions, And I think that it's worthwhile, therefore, to put together this proceeding that will be available very soon after this event. And again, it's a form to put value in the effort of the speakers and the authors. Just to give you an idea about the image of the proceedings, is the hardcover of the proceedings. And here's the second page with an ISSN number. The content, the sequence in the proceedings will start with the manuscript from Dr. Peter Davies, the Tom Alexander Memorial Lecture, follow the manuscripts from all speakers in each one of the 20 different sessions of the IPVS, order ranked in alphabetical order from antimicrobial until welfare, followed by the pre-conference lectures in African swine fever, reproduction and welfare. And lastly, but not the least, all the accepted abstracts, again, in alphabetical order from antimicrobial to the welfare sections, as will be a PDF file. The searching for a specific area, specific subject, specific author will be very easy to using the search of PDF of Acrobat Adobe. And after this event, these proceedings will be available at the official IPVS website, www.theipvs.com/links/. With that, I will conclude my part of this event. I would thank you very much, everybody, for the audience and the presence, the speakers, the authors, Dr. Peter Davies, and I will pass the screen to Fernanda Almeida again. Thank you very, very much. Fernanda?
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, Peter, for such a nice presentation, sharing with us very, very useful information. Okay, so with that, we completed the IPVS 2020 preparation cycle, but the dream is not over yet. We would like to invite you for the IPVS 2022 in Rio de Janeiro. Thank you very much for attending our webinar, and I hope that you enjoy the IPVS 2020 proceedings. Bye for now.